So welcome to this lightning talk session. I'm Louise Brown. I was a research fellow at Nottingham University until January, but now I'm an assistant professor, which is a bit wild, but I'm still doing mainly software stuff. So that's good. So this afternoon we've got 3 speakers for our lightning talks on very different subjects. So we're looking forward to that. It'd also point you in the direction of our code of conduct. If there's anything that you think's untoward, then take a look there and report that if you need to. I'm hoping that nothing untoward will happen. We've got three lightning talks. So we're going to give them about 5 minutes each, and because there are only 3 and not as many as we maybe had expected, I think what we're going to do is just let each speaker go, and then have some questions immediately afterwards, and we'll see how we go, because we're not short of time. If we get to the end and we decide we want to break up into breakout rooms, then we can do that, but we'll see how we go. So our first speaker is Sarah Leinicke, hope I pronounced that correctly, from Harvard. And I've just realized that I've gone in the wrong order. So this event is being recorded. So if you don't want to be on the recording, keep your video off and your microphone muted, and the chat function isn't recorded. So if you do want to ask a question but don't want to be on the recording, then you can put a question in the chat and we'll keep an eye on that. So our first speaker is Sarah Leinicke. And this is her subject, so I'm going to hand over to her. And
great. Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, welcome.
Here. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So my name's Sarah Leinicke. I'm a software engineer at Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences Research Computing. And today I'm going to be talking about an automated system we created to train animals for lab research. So this is the PI that we worked with. His name's Bensi Ovechki. He's a professor of organismic and evolutionary biology, and his area of research is neurocircuitry. So traditionally, this research requires a person, usually a lab tech or a research assistant, to manually train animals to perform certain tasks, like touching a lever, some sensory motor task. And this was very time intensive. It was prone to the usual human bias and error. And so to resolve these issues, we created an automated training system. So instead of having a person manually training one rat at a time to perform a task and taking manual notes on how they did that, here you see a person interacting with a user interface on a desktop. And we see many rats in the middle of the screen undergoing this automated training process. So each box that you see here has a bunch of hardware pieces on it that I've listed on the left. So you have Teensy microcontrollers that are monitoring training events, like, did the rat touch the lever? Did the rat lick the bottle after a light cue or a sound cue? We have RaspberryPis orchestrating directions to the Teensy microcontroller and then receiving logs from them. And each box has PiCameras constantly recording all the activity going on in each box. And then we have a bunch of open source software to kind of be the glue handling all of the logistics to implement this training process. So as a result of this training system that we've been running for about 2 years now, we have the comparable learning rates. So the rats are learning just as effectively as previously in the manual training process, but it's a lot less expensive. It's a lot less resource intensive. And it's also a lot easier to scale. So this video on the left shows you a rat in a box, and it looks like it's responding to a light cue, like touching its nose on something to receive a reward. So it's learned that task. And in the center, you see 6 different rat boxes. And then on the right, you see rows and rows of these training boxes. So the lab right now has 207 boxes that they're running. So very easy to scale. And I wanted to give everyone an understanding of how this actually works. So what we've done is we created state machines that work as like modular pieces to train the rat to perform, it can be other animals, in this case it's the rat, to perform certain tasks. So these on the upper left, you see 3 like examples. This is very simplified, but they get increasingly complex. So a tone conditioning on the far upper left, when it hears a sound, it learns to lick the bottle, it'll get extra water like as a reward. Once it learns that task, it moves on to the next state machine, which is that if you touch a lever, you get a reward. And then the most sophisticated task, if you make it go left and right, then you get a big reward. So it's this way of slowly training the rat to do something sophisticated using these modular pieces that are state machines. And so while this is going on, the microcontroller is constantly logging everything that's happening. You know, if when the cues happened, when the levers were pressed, when the rat licked a bottle. The cameras are constantly recording. So the researchers have all of this great, unbiased, very accurate, very specific data on all of the training processes that they can use for their research. And they can, you know, do different data analysis, such as creating the accuracy diagram on the bottom left, which shows how many hours it took for the rat to learn like the most sophisticated tasks. So here you can see like by about 300 hours, it was completing all of the stages, meaning it got to the most sophisticated task. And then you can like assume that that's how long it took, that's how long it takes the rat to learn these tasks for your research. These are example final tasks that rats have learned to do using this process. So on the left, you see the 2-tap. So the rat's learning, like if I touch it twice, then I get a reward. In the middle, you see a cued nose poke, and that's, I think, the same video that I inserted earlier. On a cue, you touch something with your nose to get a reward. And then on the right is a cued lever press. So one thing that's interesting with this approach is that researchers can share code with each other. So if researcher A has created 2-tap and researcher B for some reason needs a, say, like 3-tap, researcher B can take all of the software, all of the state machines to train a rat to do 2-tap and just tweak it a little bit for their purposes to create like a 3-tap, for example. So it gives them like a way to share with each other ways to train the rats that is like very, very effective. This is the system diagram of how we've implemented everything. So in the bottom left, you see the user. This is the end user sending experiment data to a view interface. So this includes sending the state machines, like uploading those onto the interface. The view interface then forwards all of this data, all the experiment data, to the Flask server, which stores some of it in a PostGres database, and then directs some of the code to Raspberry Pi. And then the Raspberry Pi is sending commands to the Teensy. So that's the far right, the upper right corner. And the Teensy is implementing these instructions onto the rat box and then sending logs back to the Pi. In the rat box, you also have the PiCameras that are sending logs constantly back to the Pi. And the Raspberry Pi is sending logs to lab storage and also back down below to the Flask server, which then parses all of this data, puts it in the database, and also presents it on the interface so that users can monitor the status of their experiments. They can share code with each other. They can do queries. They can view like the latest screenshot from a video or accuracy diagram like I showed earlier. So, and it also gives the PI a way to see all of the experiments running in his lab and like monitor the status of everything. So that is kind of the piece that we're finalizing now. But all of the hardware, like the Raspberry Pi, Teensy controller, and the rat boxes, that's the work that we've been running for years now. And I did want to thank my supervisor, Mahmood Shad. He's on the left here, and he wrote all of the back end code, C and Python, controlling the Raspberry Pis and the Teensies. And then the Sasha Leo, the research assistant, who implemented all of the hardware for this project. So that's my talk of, I don't know if you guys wanted me to take questions now or if you wanted to do that later.
I think we can do some questions now. We're not tight for time, I don't think. So if we just go for it while we're, yeah, if anyone has any questions, stick your hand up, unmute yourself. So Terry has one.
I have a question, yeah. I know a few people who work with lab models. Mostly it's behavioral kind of studies, but one of the things they always tell me is it's so hard to change anything in how they work with the animals because they're under so many restrictions. And there's so much of, no, this is how we do this behavioral experiment with this rat because that's how it's always been done. How long did it take to convince people that you could do something different and you could bring in an automated system for doing these kind of?
I'm not sure because I wasn't here when this was first implemented, but I imagine that there could be an argument that this might be an easier way to monitor things like I know one primary concern is like access to water. So we're constantly tracking how much water has been released and consumed by these rats, like how many licks in the bottle, for example, and how much water has been released. So I think having that automated, you could say that is just like one step on top of other steps that I'm sure the lab is taking to ensure that there's not a low water situation. I think that it takes some of the human error out of it and it makes everything very transparent. So I think you could make an argument that it's more compliant with some of the regulations.
Oh, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, Holly?
I could just follow on from Terry's question there, and this idea that sometimes animal research can be quite traditional. I'm just wondering if you've run into any instances where automation hasn't really been included. So I'm thinking of the Arrive guidelines and whether you've had to alter those in terms of what you can list under sort of the environmental conditions and whatnot, if you've run into any instances.
I haven't, and I think because this isn't really my domain, you're probably over my head. I don't know the guidelines you just mentioned.
It's just animal reporting guidelines, and I just, in my experience, they are quite traditional, and I wonder if there is maybe some work to integrate these huge strides you're taking in automation into those.
I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I'm sure that will probably naturally evolve as this is replicated more places. But yeah, that's a really interesting point. If the regulations will start to reflect some of the actual practices, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Can't see any hands going up. I was just going to ask one question. So I haven't come across Teensy microcontrollers before. Are they similar? I've just taught all last term teaching Arduino programming. Is it similar ilk to that, or is it something different?
No, I think it is very similar. I actually haven't worked directly with the Teensy, and mostly that was our research assistant who handled that. And I know he did, I think, make some specific tweaks to the Teensies, adjust some of the ports and stuff himself, so that these aren't directly out of the box. That he did have to tweak them before we use them. But I'm not sure how they different from the Arduino.
Okay, well, I've noted it down and I'll take a look.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Any more questions? well, if anyone thinks of anyone, we can come to them at the end. So our next speaker is Holly Murray. I'm not going to try more of my Zoom incompetence by trying to go to my PowerPoint and then the video. So Holly's going to do her talk by pre-recorded, because COVID and stuff with having small people in the background, it was easier to record. So we've gone for the recording. So I shall see if I can share my screen and get the recording.
Thank you, Louise.
Working.
They are surprisingly quiet right now, but I don't want to jinx it, so I'll use the recording.
Hopefully, no, that's gone to the wrong. Oh, did that get it? Okay, can you see that?
Hi, my name's Holly, and I'd like to spend the next few minutes raising awareness.
Just see your window.
Community and
okay, I got the wrong one. Does something very strange. It's flipped Zoom over to the different screen. I'm not entirely sure what's happening. So, can you see that now?
Yep.
Yeah. Is that sharing the right one? Hooray. Here we go.
Hi, my name's Holly, and I'd like to spend the next few minutes raising awareness about the code review community and encouraging each of you to join us. The code review community is a global motley crew of researchers, research software engineers, funders, publishers, and more with an interest in code review for research software. Over 50 of us first met back in October to define code review for research software and discuss the value of building consensus and community on good practices. In this meeting, we developed a fairly straightforward definition of code review. Code review for research software is the process by which a peer evaluates another's code, checking that the code does what it claims and is written in a way that can be easily read, maintained, and built upon by others. At this meeting, we also discussed the purpose of code review and focused on the intention to improve code quality and reusability, whilst also ensuring good practice and providing a learning opportunity for both parties, both the coder and the reviewer, whilst also lending, of course, to trustworthiness. And one thing that cropped up time and again in this meeting was really the idea that code review isn't any single systematic event, such as, say, peer review of an academic paper. But instead, code review may take place at different points throughout the research software lifecycle. And the code review process may vary depending on when the code is reviewed and the type of code that is actually being reviewed. So from this meeting and this vast depth of shared knowledge that was gathered back in October, 5 working groups emerged. There's a working group focusing on code review during research, code review at the time of publication, recommendations for stakeholders, and all of this is to be supported by training and education, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. Each group is invested in cultivating good practice that benefits all stakeholders, and each group will begin work this year. So it's not too late to join the conversation, and I really need to hammer home that no experience is necessary. And to give a sort of example, in case you're not yet convinced about the importance of the need of this code review community, I think if this pandemic has been good for anything, it has been identifying inequalities, gaps in knowledge, and areas for improvement. And code review, surprisingly, is no exception. Certainly the most talked about computational model of COVID-19, at least here in the UK, was that led by Neil Ferguson out of Imperial. As I'm sure many of you won't soon forget, this model was initially coined a buggy mess, totally unreliable, by many a software engineer. And of course, with no help from the media, this cast a lot of doubt on the trustworthiness of the very scientific findings which actually led England into its first lockdown, which of course now seems 20 years ago. And this is where CodeCheck came in. CodeCheck is an organization that reviews the software behind the science. Stephen Eglin, who is a code review community member and founder of this initiative, actually validated Ferguson's COVID-19 code and helped put much of that criticism to rest. All of this, again, highlighting the need for the code review community. And so it goes without saying that recent initiatives in code review, including CodeCheck, but as well as the Oxford Code Review Network and our OpenSci, have really inspired us to try and bring together the different strands of code review in an effort to provide, confidence to all stakeholders. Our deliverables, we hope, will advise research software engineers, researchers, research funders, institutions, publishers, and other organizations and open science initiatives on good practice around code review. And I think this is especially important as software becomes more deeply embedded across a wide range of disciplines. The activities of the code review community will also raise awareness about the importance of functional and reusable code in scientific research. And it's important to us as a code review community, I speak on everyone's behalf, that anyone and everyone who is interested in code review has an opportunity to participate in this community. So if this applies to you, I very much welcome you to send me an email at hollydawn_murray@gmail.com to get involved. Thanks, Emil, and I look forward to chatting.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Good. So should we open it up for questions again? Anyone, any questions? Raise a hand if you have any. Oh, have we got Anya?
Yes, hello.
Yeah.
Do you focus on any languages, programming language?
No, we've left it quite agnostic for now. And I think it's something each of the task force are going to look at individually, whether they want to customize guidelines to specific languages. So whether we can have an overarching set of good practice and then how you would tweak that in more detail to apply to different languages, but also different disciplines.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any more? Terry again.
Sorry, too many questions. I was just wondering, does it mostly apply to open source, the guidelines, or could they be adapted or used for more closed and private projects as well?
So the initial idea was that a lot of us are coming from an open source background or an open science angle. But actually, when we started talking about the recommendation to stakeholders and who those stakeholders are, it became evident that actually we need to write these in a way that we can be inclusive of proprietary examples. But again, so we've just started work. So this has all very much been discussion. And I think it remains to be seen whether that will be possible. I think that's something that's really on the table is, yeah, how can we promote good or best practice, but also within that proprietary realm, I think is going to be a bit of a struggle.
Yeah. So we've got the stakeholders working group. Is this about finding ways to target code review at researchers themselves?
Yes, so there's a few different angles to this and multiple stakeholders, but the working groups, the code review during research and code review at the time of publication are really focused on the researchers themselves and the reviewers. So those are the groups really targeting those use cases. The recommendation for stakeholders is more targeting the publishers, the institutions. So we're going to take the work we do around researchers and reviewers and say, how can these larger organizations actually support that? Because they each have a vested interest in producing quality software. You're welcome.
Any more? So I've got a question. So if you come out with a bunch of recommendations, how do you persuade researchers that it's a good thing to to actually take them up and do something about them?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a few angles we're taking. So one of the working groups is training and education. And I think a large part of training and education is actually going to be engagement and thinking of ways in which we can get researcher buy-in. I think it goes back to a lot of the lessons learned around data sharing and, you know, needing to have that bottom up as well as top down mechanism, you know, in order to really drive that. And I think this is just my idea, but I imagine after this year, so this year we want to have outputs from all 5 working groups in terms of recommendations and good practices. I imagine a whole other working group spinning off of that, of implementing it. So, you know, how do we get researchers to actually take these up? How do we get publishers, you know, to look at these? How do we get funders to look at these and actually put money towards this practice? So I think there's actually a whole other community or working group to evolve and spin off of this in the next year.
Yeah, because it's one thing to come up with all the ideas, but it's quite another to, in my experience, getting researchers to actually implement stuff and do stuff is a whole different ball game, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's already a struggle. So I know the Oxford Code Review Network, not to speak on their behalf, but you know, we've had a lot of conversations and they have a really great system up and running, but actually uptake has been, you know, the struggle, the barrier.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions on that one? Oh, have we got one here? So for the code review at publication stage, what are the main concerns apart from general best practices software engineering?
So I think from a publisher perspective, I mean, how can I say this nicely? They do a lot of things, but their main purpose is really to maintain the integrity of the scientific literature. And in the past, that has been, you know, impeded by technology in that we could only share narratives. Those narratives were peer reviewed. But I think we're getting to the point where, you know, technology allows us to move beyond that. So we can now look at the data underlying a publication, the software underlying a publication. And publishers are very quickly realizing that if they are not checking the integrity of those underlying outputs, then they can't actually maintain the integrity of the scientific literature. And I think that is their biggest concern from the publisher standpoint. In terms of what you look at the time of publication, I think there are some journals that are already doing this quite well. The Journal of Open Source Software, for example. And I think it just goes back to, you know, is the code readable? Can it be maintained? And can it be built upon? It's really the key there. Does that help?
Not sure. Oh, yeah, we've got to thank you. Good. Any more before we move on? Looks like not. Well, thanks very much, Holly.
Thank you, Louise.
We may have some more questions at the end. We'll see. So next up we have Terry, who's, I can't remember what she's talking about, but she'll tell us. Here we go. Fire away, Terry.
So close, I nearly forgot to unmute myself. So hello, everyone. So I am talking about embedding a Jupyter notebook. So this is a project that I've done with Wellcome Data Labs. So I'm a sort of contractor with the Wellcome Trust. And the Wellcome Data Labs, it's all about making more data-driven kind of decisions, both in Wellcome and also within the wider sort of research community. So what we've been doing is we've been building something that we're calling a funded data platform. So the key point of this is to actually be able to share data securely between different organizations, between universities, between researchers. And it's data that has to stay inside the platform, because at any point we want somebody to be able to revoke access to that data set, and whoever had access to it no longer can no longer access it. So nothing can be downloaded. Which means that all analysis on that data has to occur inside the platform. And we're a relatively small engineering team. There's 2 of us currently. So we were kind of working out, you know, what do we do about this? And well, the obvious decision was, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's not spend months and months building our own analysis platform or analysis tools. Let's use Jupyter notebooks, which most researchers are already very familiar with. So there were a bunch of things that we had to do to be able to embed Jupyter notebooks into our platform. The first one, essentially what was actually the easiest thing to do, was to install Jupyter Hub. Jupyter Hub is the sort of way to run Jupyter as a service. So essentially it will take in, it has its own authentication system, you can log into it, and then for each user, it will spawn a whole new notebook server for that particular user. And there's lots and lots of different ways you can set this up. So locally, we were using everything inside Docker containers, and we're using Docker spawners to spawn more Docker containers for each of our users. In our production sort of setup, this all runs inside a larger Kubernetes system. But the problem with that was we already had users authenticated in our platform. Okay, our users have already logged in. We don't want them to go, right, okay, I want to do some analysis, and now they have to log in again. So the first thing we had to kind of solve was how to integrate it by authentication. And the blog post which follows this talk goes into much more detail, obviously, than what I'm going to do here, but it was mostly involving the APIs. The other thing we wanted to do was we wanted to create and open a notebook file directly. So I'm sure most of you know, if you run Jupyter Notebooks on your desktop, the first thing that opens up is a directory. You can see all of the whole list of files that you have in wherever directory you started running it from. But in our platform, the way that we were running everything is essentially you had your list of all the different files, all of your different things that you had, data sets, etc. And if you clicked on one of them, it would open up in a new tab with the detailed view of that. We don't want someone to say, okay, I want to open this notebook, and now it opens up with a directory and they've got to click again. So we want to kind of skip that directory screen. So we had to figure out how to do that. We also didn't want to mount file drives into to our notebook servers. We wanted to keep everything stored within our own Postgres database. So we had to figure out how to say, okay, so this is the contents of our notebook. We've got this stored in our database. If someone's opening a notebook, how do we send that content to this brand new file that we've just created on a brand new server that's just been created, and make it all sort of open up seamlessly? And then the last thing we tried to do was really sort of integrate it with our own UI. And that's particularly the sort of how do you save something. So again, we wanted to keep our sort of user interface looking the same for every part of the platform. And every single page has a save button on the top right. Great, how do we get the save button on our platform to talk to and interact with the notebook server, which we're showing inside an iframe? Also, if people know a notebook file, what it looks like, it's got its own save button in there. So we've now got two save buttons on the screen, and they need to do the same thing. So yeah, so that's how what we sort of tackled. And the reason I wrote this up into a blog is that some of this was documented, but a huge amount of it wasn't. And I ended up trawling through source code. I ended up making some really random guesses at some points, which some of them luckily worked out. But it wasn't easy. So that's why I wrote it up into a blog post. Just to quickly show you, because I think I have 30 seconds left. So this is how we sort of integrated a user. So you can kind of follow the diagram here, follow the arrows. So if someone clicks on new notebook in our platform, I've just called it my app here for example, we connect to the Jupyter Hub API. We tell it to create a new user. When that user is created, we tell it to create a token for that user. That gives us the way of authentication as this particular user. We can then send another message to the API to create a server. That will spawn a brand new Docker container. Jupyter Notebook will be running inside that container. That has its own API that we can talk to. So now we can tell that API to create me a new notebook file. Once that file is created, we now have the full URL that we need to show our iframe, and we can render our page. And that's the kind of thing we did. And yeah, and there's also one on how to save a file, but I won't go into that because I am out of time. But you can have a look in my blog and ask me any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. Yeah, so hopefully everybody's had the link to the blog and to Holly's poster as well. Any questions for Terry? This is entirely out of my field, so I'm not going to come up with any intelligent questions for this one. So
ask me unintelligent questions. I respond to anything. My favorite color is blue. Yeah, no, I did go through it a little bit quickly though. I was sort of squeezing to get something in 5 minutes. I was very glad you opened it up to 5 minutes instead of 2.
I have questions. Can you talk more about your collaborative kind of efforts? So if you have multi-user, you want a collaborative kind of work, or more interactive. What kind of support you are doing in that sense?
Yeah, so what we've kind of done is we've set it up so each the sort of the different parts. So there's, in terms of sharing the data sets, everybody kind of belongs to their own organization, and each data set will belong to a particular organization. So people can collaborate in terms of uploading particular data sets, approving access requests or denying access requests. When it comes to the analysis part, we're also setting up like a project kind of overlay. So inside a particular project, you might have 2 or 3 different researchers who are working on the same sort of question. Everybody has their own, we're actually, like, the system has changed quite a bit since I first wrote this blog. And we now have a system where people can write files and have their own private workspace, essentially, where they can put the their Jupyter notebooks in. But then there's also basically a directory of shared files and shared notebooks. So we will open those up, so everybody within that project has access to all of the things that are going on. And then if anybody wants to output any data from this, obviously it has to be no longer be personal, you know, because the whole point of having a secure platform is that we can share really personal details and personal data, like all of the grants that Wellcome Trust has rejected, for example. We don't make that public normally. So the idea is then that basically anything will get approved for an output. So it's okay, so this particular notebook might get approved, or parts of it might get approved. Obviously it won't run, it won't work without the data. Or these particular graphs and figures or summary tables, which don't include anything too specific, might get output. So that's kind of how it whole works. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
We've got one in the chat from Andrew Bennett. Says, have you thought about contributing to the Jupyter Hub documentation with the knowledge you've gained on integrating with another UI?
That's actually that's a good point. I should do that. Yes, so some of it, yeah, it's quite interesting for some of the Jupyter Hub documentation, because it's not all of this is one particular part. So all the different documentation was Jupyter Hub, the Jupyter servers and notebooks itself, and then the Docker spawner for how to communicate and spawn it. So there was lots of different sort of components here. So yeah, so I think I will see if I can update some of their documentation. One of the things that's was quite annoying was, like, in Docker spawner, because there's lots and lots of different spawners, they therefore all have the same documentation sort of basic thing that they then basically can tweak if they wish to for the different spawners. And that means that some of the documentation doesn't actually match up to what the source code does. For example, it was saying in the documentation, if you put something into the environment as a user options, it will be picked up in the source code and it'll be picked up under this. And it just wasn't doing it at all. And it wasn't until I trawled through the source code that I realized that that part hasn't actually been implemented at all in Docker spawner. So, you know, the documentation doesn't necessarily match up, but yeah, no, definitely I ought to get involved.
Good. Sorry, I was trying to get the link for your blog. Oh, somebody's put it on. Good. So we've got another question. Where have we got? So one says, what is gluing all this together? JavaScript?
Mostly, yes. So some parts have to happen in our Python backend. For example, when you're doing the authentication, to be able to create a user via the API, that can only happen if you already basically have set up a service or an admin person that you have a particular token for. And so, of course, because that's a secret token that we can't expose, that happens in our Python backend. But essentially, otherwise, everything it's all JavaScript. And when you're doing the saving, you're using a post message to communicate from your site to the iframe that's running inside. So yeah, most of it was JavaScript.
Good. So thick and fast the questions are coming in. So, oh, that one's where was the link to the blog? So somebody's put that on the chat. Thank you very much.
Oh, and plug my blog post. Thank you very much. I will definitely do that.
Yeah.
Yes, and I will definitely get into the forums and doing that. It was one of those things where my boss said, you need to write a blog about this. So I wrote a blog about that and then got swamped with other projects. So never really took it much further. But yeah, no, I should definitely communicate with more people.
Good. Well, you've communicated with 25 more now, so that's good. So, any more questions for any of the speakers? If you if anyone has any questions that they thought of for the other speakers since the talk, fire away. No. Well, in that case, I would like to say a big thank you to all our speakers for today. If I can find my thing to share, is that sharing the thing? So these are the source events for the next few weeks, all sorts of stuff on there, and the links are there to find out about the program, and if you want to submit anything as well, you're more than welcome. And apart from that, I think that's probably about us for today, but we can leave the call open if anyone wants to stay around and have a chat, because we've got a quarter of an hour of our allotted hour left. So if you do think of any other questions for any of the speakers, or just want to have that networking that everyone's missing at the moment, feel free to stay. Otherwise, thanks very much for coming to the event, and thank you again to all our speakers. And I shall stop sharing that again. Thanks very much, everyone.